In the heart of the forest, where sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy, and shadows stretched like dark fingers, stood an old abandoned cabin. To most, it was nothing more than a decaying relic of a bygone era, but for Jason, a young man with a taste for adventure and a knack for uncovering the unknown, it promised a thrill he couldn't resist. Jason had heard the stories, local legends of a haunted cabin where people had vanished without a trace. The more he heard, the more intrigued he became. One crisp autumn afternoon, driven by a mix of skepticism and curiosity, he set off into the forest, determined to spend a night in the infamous cabin and disprove the myths once and for all. The journey was arduous. The trail quickly became overgrown, and the trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. By the time Jason reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting an eerie twilight over the landscape. The cabin itself was as he had imagined, weathered, with its wooden planks warped and peeling. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking with a ghostly moan as Jason pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, and the faint smell of decay lingered. He set up his camp in the main room, setting up a small fire and arranging his gear. As night fell, and the forest outside became a sea of shadows, Jason felt a sense of unease settle over him. The cabin seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, and every creak and groan of the old wood sounded like a whispering voice. Trying to shake off the feeling, Jason decided to explore the cabin. He ventured into the back rooms, discovering old furniture shrouded in dust and cobwebs. In one corner, he found an antique mirror with a tarnished frame. Its surface was covered in grime, but he wiped it clean out of curiosity. As he looked into the mirror, he saw not only his reflection, but also a fleeting shadow darting behind him. Jason spun around, but the room was empty. He chalked it up to a trick of the light and returned to his fire. As the flames crackled, the cabin seemed to come alive with strange noises, soft whispers that seemed to rise and fall like a distant melody. Around midnight, the temperature in the cabin dropped sharply. Jason's breath became visible, and the fire's warmth seemed to dissipate. He noticed that the whispers had grown louder, forming coherent words that he couldn't quite understand. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unable to sleep, he sat by the fire, his flashlight flickering. He glanced around and noticed something peculiar. The shadows on the walls seemed to move independently, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. A creeping dread filled him as he realized the shadows seemed to be forming shapes, faces, limbs, and eyes. Suddenly, the cabin fell silent. The whispers ceased, and the only sound was Jason's own breathing. He felt an icy hand on his shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced as he heard a soft, plaintive voice from the darkened hallway. "Help us." Jason stood, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The voice was coming from the back room where he had seen the mirror. He approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whispering resumed, louder and more insistent. It seemed to beckon him forward. He entered the room and found himself face to face with the mirror. This time, the reflection was different. The mirror showed not just his own image, but a scene of chaos, a forest of shadows twisted and dark with ghostly figures reaching out. Jason stared in horror as the figures in the mirror began to reach through the glass. They were spectral with hollow eyes and mouths frozen in silent screams. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled back, knocking over a nearby table. The figures in the mirror seemed to grow more frantic, their hands clawing at the glass. In a moment of sheer terror, Jason turned to run, but the room seemed to warp and twist. The shadows coalesced into a dense fog, obscuring his path. The whispers turned into anguished cries, their volume overwhelming. Jason ran blindly, trying to escape the cacophony of despair. He burst out of the cabin, the night air hitting him with a biting cold. He ran through the forest, the shadows still chasing him, their whispers echoing in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the underbrush, finally emerging onto a familiar trail. Exhausted and trembling, Jason made his way back to the edge of the forest. When he finally reached the safety of the town, he looked back toward the forest, but the cabin was no longer visible. It seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, Jason woke up in his own bed, the events of the night feeling like a vivid nightmare. But as he reached for his flashlight, he found something disturbing. A smear of dust on the lens, and in the dust, the faint outline of a ghostly handprint. Jason never spoke of what he experienced in the cabin, but he knew one thing for certain. Some places were best left undisturbed, and some shadows were best left in the dark. Sarah and Tom had been looking forward to their weekend escape for months. It was supposed to be a refreshing break from the relentless pace of city life. They had chosen a remote cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of modernity. The weather was perfect, a crisp autumn day with golden leaves fluttering in the breeze and the sun casting a warm, inviting glow. As they loaded their backpacks with supplies and set out, the forest seemed to welcome them with open arms. The trail was well marked, winding through a picturesque landscape of towering oaks and maples, their leaves ablaze with hues of orange and red. Birds chirped merrily, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. The first few hours of hiking were idyllic. They joked and laughed, their conversations flowing easily. The path was gentle and they made good time, stopping occasionally to take in the views or snap a few photos. The sound of a distant brook added a soothing soundtrack to their journey. Around midday, they reached a clearing with a small wooden sign indicating the direction to their cabin. The sign was weathered but legible, pointing them along a narrower, less traveled path. Tom consulted the map, nodding with a sense of accomplishment. We're right on track. Should be just a few more miles. As they ventured onto the narrower path, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that dimmed the sunlight. The path became less distinct, hidden beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. Despite the growing darkness, they pressed on, reassured by their sense of direction. By late afternoon, the light began to wane. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted among the trees. The once cheerful chirping of birds faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The trail markers grew sparse and the map seemed less reliable. The comfortable feeling of their journey had begun to shift, replaced by an unsettling sense of isolation. Tom glanced at his watch, noting the time. We should be getting close. Let's push through. Sarah, though hesitant, nodded. The forest seemed to close in around them as they walked. The silence grew heavier, interrupted only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The dense foliage made it difficult to gauge their exact location, and the comforting landmarks they had noted earlier were now obscured. As twilight descended, the forest took on a foreboding quality. Shadows deepened, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The cheerful colors of autumn were replaced by a monochrome palette of grays and blacks. Tom's confident stride faltered, his footsteps becoming hesitant. I think we might have missed a turn, Tom said, his voice betraying a hint of concern. Sarah's heart raced as she peered into the gathering gloom. Are you sure? I thought we were on the right path. They pressed on, trying to ignore the rising anxiety. The darkness seemed to have a tangible weight pressing in from all sides. The familiar trail was now a maze of indistinguishable paths. Every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the forest, further from their intended destination. Just as panic began to set in, a faint, flickering light appeared in the distance. Relief surged through them. "Look, over there!" Sarah pointed towards the light. They hurried towards it, their exhaustion giving way to a burst of hopeful energy. As they drew closer, they saw that the light was coming from a small, dilapidated cabin. The structure was nestled in a small clearing, its weathered walls covered in thick ivy. A single lantern hung by the door, casting a dim, unsteady glow. Tom pushed open the creaking door and they stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by the flickering firelight from a neglected hearth. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the lantern's faint light. The furniture was old and covered with sheets, adding to the sense of abandonment. They set down their backpacks, eager to escape the oppressive night. Sarah moved to the fireplace and, after some effort, managed to ignite a small fire. The warmth was welcome, and the crackling of the flames provided a soothing contrast to the cold, dark forest outside. As they settled into the dusty armchairs, Sarah noticed an old, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It depicted a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the very cabin they now occupied. The photograph was sepia-toned and worn, the edges curling and fraying. Their smiles were frozen in a moment of happiness, but their eyes seemed oddly intense, as if they were staring straight through the glass. "This must have been their cabin," Sarah said, holding the photograph up to the light. "Look at how happy they look." Tom glanced at the photograph, his gaze lingering on the family's faces. "Yeah, but something about it feels off." As night fell, the comforting warmth of the fire began to feel inadequate. The once inviting glow of the flames seemed to cast longer, more exaggerated shadows. The room's corners grew darker, and the soft rustling of the firewood was occasionally interrupted by strange, subtle creaks and groans from the old cabin. Sarah, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, began to prepare a simple meal. Tom busied himself with setting up their sleeping arrangements, but neither could fully shake the feeling that something was wrong. Just as they were about to eat, a soft whisper seemed to drift through the room. Sarah paused, listening intently. The sound was so faint that she thought it might be her imagination. Tom glanced up, a puzzled look on his face. "Did you hear that?" Sarah shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Maybe it's just the wind?" They continued with their meal, but the whispers persisted. They were indistinct at first, like murmurs just beyond hearing, but gradually they became more noticeable. The sounds were almost like a faint, distant conversation, though they could never quite make out the words. As the evening wore on, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. They seemed to come from all directions, weaving in and out of their awareness. The shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen and shift, though they remained still when they looked directly at them. Tom tried to reassure Sarah, though his own unease was growing. "It's probably just the old structures settling. You know, creaks and groans." Sarah tried to agree, but the creeping feeling of discomfort persisted. The photograph on the mantel caught her eye again, and she noticed something strange. The family's eyes seemed even more intense, their gazes fixed on her with a newfound scrutiny. "Tom," she said hesitantly, "look at the photograph. Did you see something strange?" Tom looked over and frowned. "It's just a photo. What's wrong?" Sarah's unease deepened, but she said nothing more. They decided to turn in early, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear their minds. As they prepared for bed, the whispers became a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to linger just on the edge of their hearing. They lay down on the old, musty beds, trying to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. The darkness of the room grew thicker, and the whispers seemed to seep into their thoughts. Every now and then, they would hear a soft, scratching sound, as if something was trying to get through the walls. Sleep came fitfully. Tom tossed and turned, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and faint, mournful cries. Sarah, too, found her rest interrupted by eerie, half-formed images and distant, haunting voices. Around midnight, Sarah was jolted awake by a sudden intense cold. The temperature in the room had dropped sharply, and she could see her breath fogging in the air. She sat up, shivering, and noticed that the fire had dwindled to almost nothing. She got out of her bed and added more wood, but the fire seemed reluctant to catch. Tom stirred and groggily sat up. "What's going on?" "It's freezing," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "The fire's gone out." Tom got up and tried to stoke the fire, but despite their efforts, it refused to return to its previous warmth. The cold seemed to seep into their bones, and the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. The voices were now more recognizable, though still indistinct, their tone carrying a note of frustration and despair. The shadows in the room began to shift more noticeably. The shapes seemed to move just out of the corner of their vision, always vanishing when they turned to look directly at them. The old furniture creaked and groaned, adding to the sense of unease. Tom went to the door to check if the cold was coming from outside. He tugged on the handle, but the door was stuck. He pushed harder, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to creep in as he realized that they were trapped. Sarah joined him, and they both pulled at the door in vain. The whispers grew louder, and the room seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, almost heartbeat-like vibration. The air grew heavier, and the cold intensified, making it hard to think clearly. Suddenly, the photograph on the mantel fell to the floor, shattering into pieces. Sarah picked up one of the fragments and gasped. The eyes of the family in the photographs seemed to follow them, their expressions now twisted in fear and anguish. Tom's face went pale as he looked at the photograph. Something's really wrong here. The whispers grew into a cacophony of anguished cries and pleading voices. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with purpose, coalescing into vague, distorted figures. The once familiar room now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on them. Sarah and Tom huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The temperature continued to drop, and the room was filled with a chilling, otherworldly cold. The figures from the photograph began to take shape, their ghostly forms reaching out with spectral hands. Desperation turned into terror as the shadows lunged towards them. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls pulsating with a final, throbbing heartbeat before everything went dark. When dawn broke, the forest was silent and still. The cabin stood abandoned, its door ajar. The only signs of the night's events were the shattered photograph and a lingering, haunting whisper that seemed to echo through the cold morning air. Welcome home.